Welcome back to the Traincare facility. So it's Autism Acceptance Month once again, and so I wanted to do another video discussing my experiences as an autistic person. For those who don't know, I was diagnosed with autism and ADHD from a young age, and whereas previously I have talked about how being autistic affects me today, mainly through the challenges I have with social skills and also my hyperfixations and special interests and so on, what I wanted to do this time is to look back on how it affected my life growing up and coming through school and college as someone who was considered different or special, or however euphemistically you want to describe it. And just to warn you, this isn't going to be entirely positive, but I think it is important to portray both sides and to show the negative as well as the positive. So there will be discussion of social rejection and childhood depression, and so feel free to skip this video if any of that makes you uncomfortable or maybe hits a bit too close to home. My memories of primary school are quite vague for the most part, but I do know that my parents had a lot of difficulty actually getting me into a school, and I did have to be homeschooled for a while, which I do remember. Basically, my first school I got expelled from, and then my parents attempted to get me into a posh private school, which, as you can imagine, didn't last for very long before the other parents complained and probably threatened to withdraw their kids from the school. At least that's how I imagine the conversation went. It's kind of a fun conversation starter to say that I was excluded from two different schools, but looking back it also feels very messed up to me that schools have the ability to say, okay, well, we'll accept these other kids, but not this child, because we don't want this child. I do appreciate that a lot of schools are probably quite stretched in terms of the staff and the resources they have available to deal with certain situations, and to be clear, this was back in the early 2000s, so I don't really know if things are any different now. But what people don't necessarily realise is that even at that young age you do have a level of awareness, and being repeatedly singled out and rejected, not just by your peers but by institutions as well, does take a toll on you mentally. Even once my parents did finally manage to get me into a school, there are distinct memories I have of being singled out is the best way I can describe it. Like on one occasion, all the other boys in my year group, of which I think there were 4 other boys, were called into the hall to help with tidying up some equipment. I think it was gym stuff, so like mats and benches and so on, and this was during break time as I remember, and I was told that I wasn't needed and I should go back outside. And what sticks in my memory about that day is that I overheard one of the teachers or one of the staff outside actually complaining about it, saying that it didn't seem right that there are 5 boys in my year group and 4 of them are invited in to go and help with something and I'm told to go away essentially. And you might be thinking, that doesn't mean anything, you're reading too much into it. But you've got to understand, that was just one experience. From a very young age I got used to being singled out and treated differently, and one of the worst examples that is still a bitter and painful memory for me actually came right at the very end of my time at primary school. Basically there was a tradition every year where the leavers would have a camp out in the courtyard in the middle of the school buildings, and I had been really looking forward to it, but because a member of staff who was supposed to be there had fallen ill, I believe, that meant I wasn't allowed to do the camp out. Just me, of course, the others were all still allowed to be there, but I was the autistic one, so my parents had to come and pick me up. And that was a deeply upsetting experience for me. Not that anyone would have really appreciated it at the time, because I was just a kid, and kids don't have feelings, right? You can tell someone at that age that everyone else gets to do the thing you're really looking forward to, but you don't, you're not allowed, because you're different. That's not going to hurt them or emotionally scar them in any way. Except that it does hurt. I still vividly recall seeing my parents waiting there by the door to collect me, and there was part of me that wanted to go up and punch them or something. It wasn't their fault, of course, but just the sight of my mum and dad standing there was mortifying, and it was like a punch to the gut. After I started high school is when I became more socially aware and conscious of the fact that I didn't have any friends. I was still conscious of some of the ways I was being treated differently by the school, for instance the fact that a lot of the time time in class I would have a member of support staff with me, but the main reason why that bothered me was because I imagined the other kids in the classroom would see that I had the big teacher sitting next to me, as I used to call it, and that would reinforce the perception that I was different in the minds of the other kids, and therefore someone that they would not want to be friends with or associate with. Because by that stage I was painfully aware of the fact I wasn't being treated the same. You know, as I've said before, I didn't really have any social skills at that time, but I did try to socialise. I would hang out with social groups at school, but I was never invited to any of their parties. They would all go around each other's houses, and I would see the photos on social media afterward, and that used to really hurt, because I wanted to be a part of that, but I didn't get to be. It's weird, I have a friend of mine now who said that with neurotypical kids, it's kind of like they have a detector built into them, and the minute you show signs of being autistic or having any form of neurodivergence, they can sense that something is wrong, no matter how hard you try, and so they avoid you, or they don't treat you like another person who is capable of your own emotional autonomy. It's kind of like, okay, mild spoilers here for the movie Nimona, but the main character of Nimona is a shapeshifter, essentially, and there's a flashback scene at one point where you see her shapeshifting into different animals, attempting to befriend the different species of animals, and they're all avoiding her and trying to get away from her, like they can just sense that something is off, that something isn't right, and it's kind of like that, essentially. Now that I think about it, there's so much in that movie that is just really on point. Looking back now, I realise that I was also being infantilized a lot growing up. One instance that springs to mind from when I was at sixth form, I believe that's the equivalent of the final years of high school for those who are in America, is there was an occasion where there was a group of the other kids and I was trying to join in with the conversation, and I happened to say the word orgasm, and when I said that, they kept asking me to repeat the word and laughing. Now bear in mind, I was probably about 16 years old at the time, and so I was sexually aware, and I definitely knew what that word meant. But because of the way I had kind of been infantilized, the idea of me saying that word to the other kids was really funny. I think part of the reason possibly why I live the lifestyle I do now is as an act of rebellion against the way I was infantilized growing up. Hopefully this isn't TMI, but for those who don't know, I am fully sex positive, kink positive, polyamorous and hyperromantic, and part of that might also be a response to the way that I was denied so much of that growing up. As I say, when others were having their first kiss or experiencing other forms of intimacy, I was barely able to even make any friends, and part of me still kind of resents that, not just because of the intimacy, but the overall social experience of growing up as a teenager that I missed out on, because you can never get that time back. Ultimately, the result of all of this social rejection and alienation was that I came to see autism as something really negative. I would never openly tell anyone I was autistic without being prompted, and if I had to, I would prefer to say I had Asperger's, because to me that was like the better version of having autism. Of course, the community don't really use that term anymore because of its uncomfortable connections with eugenics, which is perhaps kind of fitting in a weird way, because I think at the time I kind of saw myself as an undesirable. The really messed up part is that if you had asked me at that time, my ultimate dream would have been that one day I could learn to be normal and to assimilate myself. That one day a doctor would take a look at me and say that actually they got my diagnosis wrong and I wasn't autistic after all, or at least not anymore. Now that I think about it with hindsight, I know that at that time I was pretty depressed. In fact, I think the only time in my life that matched that as a low point is the period when I was unemployed after I finished university. Because again, you might not be emotionally mature at that age, but you still have emotional agency, and you do still feel. I do want to conclude this video on a more positive note, because there is a positive here. The thing that really changed my outlook on being autistic as I got older was finding community, finding other people who are neurodiverse, and realizing that there are people who not only will accept you for who you are, but who are open and proud about being autistic, because ultimately, it is not something to be ashamed of or to be treated as taboo. The biggest point I want to emphasize to anyone who has made it this far and can perhaps relate to some of the experiences I've described is do not ever try to hide or change who you are. It might be difficult and it might be painful, but things can get better. They can always get better. And to anyone who has been there, I see you. And you are not alone. We are all valid and we are all in this together.